Howdy, everybody. This is Jeff Morton. I decided to go for a little walk this morning and bring my cell phone along with me, along with my new setup. And I'm down on the banks of the Puyallup River here in Washington State. Now, I told you guys that I was going to make a video. Actually, I'm making a three-part video, and I wanted to address three areas. One of which was about the whole black racist thing. And so for this particular part of the video, here down by the Puyallup River, it's a Sunday morning. I want to talk a little bit about racism and the history of racism, if I can. I'm not going to belabor the point. I'm just going to kind of give you some of the stuff that I've learned over the last 40 years. Primarily, I've learned that most of the stuff that we were taught in the school systems is revised history. It's not actually true. And so this all began for me in 1979 when I was in the Navy and Ronald Reagan won the election and Jimmy Carter lost. It was a landslide. I was on a ship with 1,500 people, and I've told this story many times. But the 1,500 people, for the most part, there was an uproar of celebration on the boat. And I wanted to know why. I had come from New York State, Rochester, New York, to Portland, Oregon, and then to the Navy. So now I'm kind of on my own as a 18, 19-year-old young man, and I'm in this Navy, and I wanted to know why the celebration went up for this new president versus Jimmy Carter. We hated Jimmy Carter because we had stand-down orders. We couldn't fight back when it came to dealing with the Iranian hostage situation. And I know some of you older folks like myself are going to understand what I mean. Carter was a pacifist. And so I wanted to understand this whole dichotomy. Well, that opened the door for me to begin to study. And I started studying the racial issues between the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. And eventually I found out that most of the stuff we'd learned in high school or in grade school was what the school systems wanted us to learn, but it wasn't actual history. Well, because I began to understand what revised history was, I began to dig a little deeper and try to figure out for myself more answers to the questions that I now had. For example, I had no idea that there were black slave owners in the South, in the southern states. I knew absolutely nothing about the Arab slave trade and how horrific it was for 1,400 years in certain parts of Africa. I had no idea about the death march in the Sahara, sub-Sahara Africa, where hundreds of thousands of Africans died being marched across the desert. I didn't know about little black babies that were born to Islamic concubines that were stabbed and killed as they came out of the womb because they were too dark. I knew nothing about the black African who was small in stature. These were usually castrated, and they became slaves to the elite in the Arab communities. The bigger black man was often used as a warrior, and he was put in the wars. And almost all of them were slaves, and they were forced into a life of servitude. Well, I began to see that that was much more horrific than the European slave trade, particularly with the Dutch and the English, and ultimately with America. And obviously I realized that most of the slaves didn't come to America. They populated the Caribbean and various parts around the United States of America. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that the slave trade was not horrific. It was horrific. It was terrible. But I wanted to understand that whole thing. How was Islam responsible for the worst form of slavery known to humanity? Well, that opened up other doors for me to study in other areas. And I came across Professor Frank M. Snowden, Jr. He was an archaeologist and professor at Howard University. He died in 2007. And he wrote a couple of books, Blacks in Antiquity and I forget the name of one of the other books that he wrote, but he kind of went back through the historical account of racism, and he couldn't find much with regard to the Greek and Roman civilization. In fact, he came to the conclusion that most of the racism that we understand is relatively new. Then I came across Benjamin Isaac's work, and his book was called The Invention of Racism. And he attributes a lot of the racism that we have today in the world to the age of enlightenment. He points out a specific individual. His name was Baffon, Louis Baffon, George Louis Baffon, who wrote a book, I can't remember the name of it, in the 1700s. And he compared the blacks to, in this way. He said the white man was the horse and the black man was the donkey. In other words, we were of lesser stature. And really that kind of gave rise to a lot of the modern racism that we understand today, according to Benjamin Isaacs. So as I began to study racism from that context, a panacea of information opened up to me outside of the angry, traditional black American story that the white man was evil and the white man was this and the white man was that. Slavery was far worse in the Islamic nations on the blacks. In fact, if you stop and really think about it, the white man was buying the slaves from the Islamic Caliphate for much of its existence. So, and that's not to say that the Caliphate had other slaves of different skin colors. But the color of skin was not a remarkable thing in the ancient world. In fact, many of the Roman guards and generals, they were blacks. In that particular day and age, you had what was called the caste system, and I would say that racism today is kind of born from that, although the caste system was, there was the have-nots and the haves, the elites and the little people, the villagers, the town folk. And like Dina Dye often mentions, most of the people we read about in the Bible, they didn't mix up with the elites. They weren't part of the kingdoms and the queens and the upper echelon. They were just agricultural farmers for the most part, and fishermen. They didn't have an audience with the president, if you will, on a regular basis. So when I talk about racism, bigotry, and anti-Semitism it was born completely in the church system through the teachings of the church fathers. And there's a plethora of information on that subject. But anti-Semitism is a product of church theology. Largely, the Jews were replaced by the church. I was talking to a doctor the other day, and as we were talking, he made the statement that, well, the Jews rejected becoming Christians, and therefore the entirety of Israel was done away with because Jesus raised up the church in order to keep the message going. And I thought, well, that's the fundamental belief in a lot of churches, mainline churches, Lutheran, Pentecostal. It's just kind of, that's just kind of normal. It's a way of traditional thinking. Likewise, because we've thought that way and been taught that way for the past 1,800 years, it's just intrinsic to the values that we hold. The same is true in racism. We, in the black community, if my conversation is not couched in racism or the white man did this to the black man, or I'm black and I'm proud, or I'm trying to reestablish my identity, if it's not part of that mindset, then I'm immediately looked down upon. In other words, I can't have an opinion about anything else if it doesn't fall in line with the traditional understanding of black American slavery. Well, I've researched enough to know that most of that is just, it's like holding on to the anger. It's like celebrating the unforgiveness. It's like a badge of honor to say that we came out of the slave trade, we came out of white slavery, and the white man is forever responsible. And, that's just not true. That's not true. So when I'm talking to black folks and I don't toe the line, or I don't do what's expected of me, and particularly in the church systems, then I'm automatically not black anymore, and I'm an Uncle Tom, I'm an Oreo, I'm whatever I am, but I'm not one of them. And to me, that's just stupid. I mean, it's just stupid. And for me to say that there's a great big segment of the American public that's stupid, it's a fact. Because I can't have my own opinion. I can't research out a matter. I can't come to a different conclusion if it differs from the whole or the majority of black Americans. I don't see myself as a minority. I see myself as a child of the kingdom of God, which is the ultimate kingdom. So how on earth could I possibly consider myself to be a minority? So what I'm saying in this little segment is this. If your relationship to the God of creation is based on racism, and if you harbor bigotry as a result of what happened in the past, and if you're a little nervous about the Jewish people and celebrate anti-Semitism like Louis Farrakhan and others, then you're missing the whole point of what God called love thy neighbor. Your reality is based on the societies that mankind has raised up in literally as an adversarial way of thinking to the things that God is doing. So I'm a biblical person. I'm not necessarily a person who follows a denomination. I'm not necessarily a person who follows the traditional thinking of modern Judaism. In fact, because of where modern Judaism stands, I have to disagree with it. But there's a lot of information within Christianity and Judaism to be learned from. I really don't spend a lot of time understanding Islam because I abhorrently disagree with it. I disagree with killing and murdering and all that craziness in order to bring in the Mahdi, and I'm just not there. However, I think we can learn from each other. And I think when we go back and we start unraveling the historical account, then different accounts come up other than what we hold on to and what we've been taught. And so I just refuse to be a colored person before I am a kingdom person. And if the believer out there doesn't understand that, then your mindset is based on an adversity against the kingdom of God, because what he calls for is for one new man. What he wants in the kingdom that he is establishing in the earth is for peace and order and civility and just appreciation for the fact that he is raising up an eternal reality, not a temporary one. And so for me, I'd rather think on the level of an eternal reality as opposed to a temporal reality that is couched in a bunch of revised history. Really, it's revised history. I love the works of Wayne Perryman. He wrote a book called Unfounded Loyalty, which really does take the entire discussion of the Democrat and Republican Party, and it puts it in a historical account, and you begin to understand just how horrific the Democrat Party has been through the years. I became a conservative as a result of some of the studying that I had done over the course of the last 40 years. In fact, I became a conservative probably 40 years ago. But I'm more of a biblical conservative as opposed to a Republican or political conservative. So my positions are biblically based, but also they're structured based on the history that I've researched. And I can tell you for a fact that what we hold on to in the black community in America is killing us. It's absolutely killing us. We keep searching for an identity as opposed to accepting our own humanity. And that to me is the travesty of hanging on to the anger of racism, bigotry, and anti-Semitism. So this is part one or part two of this video that I'm putting together. And I came down here to the Puyallup River just because I needed to get out of my house for a little while. And I wanted to take a little walk, and I wanted to bring this camera out here and tie it on my phone. But the next segment that I'm going to be talking about with regard to why I'm doing this video has to do largely with revised history, because if we as Christians were taught that the Jews killed Jesus, then going forward from that moment on, the Jews were persecuted and horribly tortured by a lot of the historical churches of the European countries. And so I kind of want to touch on that subject next. But I am making a 3-part video, and I just want to simply say to you folks that we need to study history, because without it, we're doomed to repeat it. And if we as believers don't understand the biblical history, then we're kind of lost. And the biblical history starts and stops with the nation of Israel, not the church. And that's kind of where my mindset is today. So this is Jeff Morton. We're about 15 minutes long, and that's as long as I wanted to do this, okay? So stay tuned. I'm going to put all 3 parts together and present this video online shortly. Maybe later on today. I'm not sure yet, okay? Have a great day. Bye-bye.